5,
4,
3,
2,
1.
Tom Velasco, everybody.
And Tucker Maile.
Welcome to the Tuck and Tom show on YouTube and the various podcast services.
Pretty much anywhere you could
Anywhere
find
the internet is reaching you. We are
Yes.
happy that it's gotten into your device, whether it's a laptop, mobile phone, or a smart TV.
Yeah, I guess it could be a smart TV.
Yeah.
Yeah, or like an Apple TV that connects to a regular TV.
Whatever device,
some device.
you may be using.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Good to see
Thank you.
It's been
Good
a minute.
Yeah,
You've
been
been
a while.
traveling.
I have been.
How's life?
Life's pretty good,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah, I mean, it's there's some stresses, but things have gotten
Always a little bit
there's
stressful.
Always a little bit. There's always a little bit of stress.
You're like Hulk.
How am I like?
You're always stressed.
That's my secret,
Yeah,
Cap. I'm always stressed.
I'm always
actually
stressed.
remember. I thought it was I'm always exercising,
Yes. My secret is.
which of course taps into.
Yes.
For those of you guys who did watch yesterday, I referenced my walking in Italy, which was pretty extensive. 20,000 steps my first day there, which
Wow.
was my phone said that I'd gone from 1,100 steps on average to 20,000.
Okay.
It's a big big gap. Yeah.
Yeah, and they reported your cell phone had stolen.
Yes. Yes.
Someone has stolen Tom's phone.
It was a good trip though, and I got to go to places I hadn't seen. I'd never been to Venice, which
Awesome.
if you get a chance to go to Venice, go to Venice. It's really beautiful. Have you been?
I have been to Venice with Michael Del Campo. If you're watching,
You guys went to Venice?
yeah, Del Campo and I went. We hitchhiked through Europe and kind of went where the rides would take us. And Venice was one of the spots that we.
I knew about his hitchhiking through Europe because he and I were supposed to do it. We spent a month in Amsterdam,
Yeah.
and at the end of the trip, he was pleading with me
come to Europe.
to come hitchhike all across Europe with him,
Yeah.
and I was skeptical for various reasons. The most prominent one being that I was supposed to play in a championship football game.
Yeah.
I know that sounds weird, but I was part of a semi-pro football league.
Yes.
And our team was in the championship, and I needed to come back to play. So
And you ended up quitting that team.
no, I finished the season.
I thought they required too many steps.
They did require a lot of steps.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. I could walk. I had more steps in me then
Yeah. Well, we all did back then.
than I do. I know. Every year it's like I have less steps in me, or fewer
Walk a little
steps.
less. Get your steps in, everybody.
Yeah.
Well, as always, you teach and then we talk. And
Yes.
so last night you taught on Revelation chapter 4.
Yep.
And some questions have come in.
Revelation
Chapter 5.
Yep.
Some questions have come in from that. And some questions are also, as always, people listen to you talk and it triggers other things
Yes.
for them to think about and
Yep.
talk about. So should we get into it?
Yeah.
Let's get into it. Tucker Maile with Tom Velasco. Now getting into it with question number 1. Revelation chapter 4, you mentioned that maybe the prophecy of the last 7-year period had to do with Titus. How do we reconcile this if Revelation was written at a later date?
Yeah.
So give us a little context.
Yes, let me
background
clarify
story,
that.
And then
I pointed out that one interpretation of the book of Revelation is what is called the preterist interpretation. And the preterist interpretation basically says that the book of Revelation is not about the end of time like so many people believe, but it's rather a prophecy from John's perspective. It would be a prophecy for him. It's in the future from his vantage point, but it's in our distant past. And so what the preterists believe is that the book of Revelation is primarily about the impending destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Okay. Now, I've not alluded to this. I've mentioned this when teaching Revelation, that this is a little problematic because most people believe, and I think that most arguments point to the idea that John wrote the book of Revelation around 95 AD. So that would be a problem because if it's a prophecy, meaning John's prophesying about some future thing, if it's a prophecy, then presumably it would have to be about the future. But if the temple is destroyed in 70 and John is writing in 95, then it's not a prophecy. It's like reflecting back. So I actually have already said when teaching through Revelation, I can't remember which chapter I was talking about, maybe chapter 1 or 2. I did point out that I don't believe that the book of Revelation is about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. I don't believe that. So I don't agree with the preterist view. But let me explain how they get past this problem. They get past it by arguing that that most scholars are wrong, that the book of Revelation was not written in 96 AD or 96-ish, and instead would have been written in 68 AD, 2 years before the destruction of the temple. And so like I said, most people believe that John wrote this during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, which was in the 90s. So they try to argue that no, he was instead writing it during the reign of the Emperor Nero, which was in the 60s. So both Nero and Domitian persecuted Christians, both. So they just try to say that John was in the earlier time. Now I do want to say this: there are very few good reasons to believe that John wrote this book in the 60s. When you look for evidence about who wrote a book, you usually are looking for two kinds of evidence. One is external evidence, that is what other people say or some kind of archaeological fact to back something up. And the other is internal evidence, that is things within the book. I didn't have time to do a thorough look into this, but the preterists, as far as I can tell, I only landed on one serious argument, and it's an argument about the internal witness of the book of Revelation. That seemed to imply that it was written prior to 70 AD. And their argument focuses in on the book of Revelation. I think it's chapter 11, verse 1, in which, as a part of the vision, John is told to measure the temple, right? And there's no statement about the temple not being there, the temple having been destroyed. And so they argue that if the temple had been destroyed, John clearly would have made some distinction there. So he assumes that the temple is still there in the vision. That's actually a pretty interesting point. But at the same time, you have to realize that he has already stated that this book is a prophecy. It is a vision, presumably about something either in the future, as we've already talked about, or as I've been talking the last couple of studies, as something that is hidden kind of behind the scenes, right? Something that is like a heavenly realm. And the reality is that you look back at the book of Ezekiel in the latter chapters, from, I think it's like the late 30s, 40s of the book of Ezekiel. After the temple had been destroyed, Ezekiel gives a prophecy about a future temple. So there is this idea that there is possibly, or that there will be, a future temple. And that would be one that is being told about that might exist, for instance, during a millennial kingdom or something along those lines. And so, this fits into the futurist perspective, which is that a temple, like the futurists believe, a temple is going to be rebuilt, and that's the temple that is being described in Revelation.
And does that temple, in their view, have to be built before the return of Christ, or Christ can return and then administer the construction of a temple? So
it's funny. I talk about futurists, I talk about preterists. The reality is there's tons of different futurists, tons of different preterist views, right? Like the reality is there's so many different interpretations. So some futurists believe that the temple is going to be rebuilt either prior to the 7-year tribulation or early in the tribulation. So they'll say that it's going to be rebuilt then, whereas others think it could be referencing a millennial temple. So it just kind of depends.
Is there any prophecy update, whispers or murmurs about that being at all on the horizon?
I'm not this is one thing I'm not. I don't look into, like so many people, and I don't mean to criticize anybody. I just don't. It's not my interest. I don't know that it's really useful.
You don't follow that blog.
But I don't go into looking for things that might update us in the news about some potential prophetic fulfillment. Mm-hmm. I have heard many times from many different people that of course, in Israel, there are certainly organizations and people who want to rebuild the temple, and many of these organizations have done work on that process to rebuilding a temple, at least as much work as can be done on it. I mean, as it stands now, the Israelites do not have the ability to build on the Temple Mount. Right? The Temple Mount is currently under the control of non-Israelite Arabs, right? So to take control of it would be a massive war, like a war that goes beyond comprehension, right? Because the Temple Mount, being the most holy site in Israel's history, is the second most holy site in Islam, or second or third. I forget. I think it's the second, because it's the place supposedly where Muhammad was caught up into heaven, according to their view. But built there on that site is the Dome of the Rock, which is what is the most prominent building there now, and then the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which are two incredibly important Muslim monuments.
The idea would be to restore animal sacrifice in the temple.
Yeah, that would be the idea. And people want to do that. And there have even been priestly outfits designed for it, and that stuff's true. Like, I mean, in fact, as a lot of you guys know, we're taking a trip to Israel here fairly soon. Well, it'll be in the spring. And my understanding is that when you go on a tour, they actually show you some of this stuff.
Wow.
So there is that potential. Backing up, though, really quickly, my understanding, from what I came across, that Revelation chapter 11 passage, which to me could mean...
The measuring.
Yeah, about measuring the temple. That could be referencing the temple that was destroyed in 70 AD. It totally could. But it also, I think, could be referencing a prophetic temple. Like, I don't think it has to be the one that was still standing back prior to 70 AD in Jerusalem. Aside from that, I couldn't find a very good argument that put it prior to 70 AD. Whereas I found a lot of arguments that it was written like in the 90s, including, for instance, the church father Irenaeus, who would have been walking with the Lord within 30 years of when it was written, or 40 years when it was written. So it's like, and he actually says that the book of Revelation was completed not long before our lifetimes during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. So these guys are saying that it was written then. The earliest church fathers we have say it was written in the 90s under the persecution of Domitian. There's other things like internally that seem to imply that it was written during that time. For instance, when you read the letters to the churches, right? John's writing to churches, or I should say Jesus through John is writing to churches in Asia Minor, in Turkey. He writes a letter to the church of Sardis, which, according to one of the church fathers, hadn't even been founded before 70 AD, that it was founded a little later. Also, the letters, I forget, man, I'm blanking which church it is now. Is it Sardis? I'm forgetting, but it refers to one of those churches as the seat of Satan. And the implication, or I should say how most interpreters think of it, is it's the place in which the imperial cult worship was conducted. And the idea is that people think that the failure to worship the emperor in that way is what got John exiled to Patmos. Well, the Emperor Domitian was persecuting in Asia Minor, in Turkey. That was the locale of his persecution, and it was the failure to follow the imperial cult during the time. There are lots of reasons to think it was written in the 90s.
If it was, in fact, written in the 90s under Domitian, is that a defeater to the preterist?
Yes. Preterism cannot exist preterism cannot be the proper interpretation if it was written in the 90s. Can't, right? So I'm not 100% certain it was written in the 60s, in the 90s and not in the 60s. But I'm like, as much as I think I can be certain about this, I'm pretty certain about this.
Can you maintain a Domitian era in the writing timeline and some preterist views?
Yes. So there are different kinds of preterism. So there's another kind of preterism which says that, and this one I'm a lot more open to, which says that the book of Revelation is not about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, but rather the fall of the Roman Empire in 476. And that kind of preterism absolutely fits.
And that allows you to interpret the churches as literal churches in all of the cities that were written to.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody can interpret those as literal churches. It's just that some people will take them as having a secondary metaphoric meaning as well.
Really interesting. Great question. Thank you so much, Anonymous. We love when you write in. Question number 2. When and how did Judas deconstruct his faith?
Yeah, so I saw this question last night, and I've been kind of playing it through my head, wondering, and forgive me whoever wrote it in. I'm sorry if I misunderstand, because I'm not entirely certain what's being asked here. So I would definitely encourage whoever wrote this and anybody listening to go back to the Tuck and Tom YouTube channel and look up our section on deconstruction, where we kind of, and maybe the person who wrote this question in did watch that. In fact, that would make sense, because it perhaps is kind of fresh on your mind.
Yeah, maybe a response to that.
Yeah, so because it's really important to understand what I want to say about this, that you know what we said about deconstruction. So if you didn't, I'd go back and see that. But it seems to me that there are a couple of different ways I could interpret this question. The first is like genuine curiosity. Did Judas deconstruct his faith? And if so, how? What I would say to that is, first of all, the term deconstruction, which I did say in that podcast, is a new term. And I'm not saying that nobody ever deconstructed, whatever that means, prior to the invention of this term or prior to this word coming into usage.
It's in vogue.
But it's not the kind of thing anybody would have said back then or anybody would have used, right? And so in one sense, you would have to say it wouldn't be appropriately applied to anybody back then. However, if we just use deconstruction as a word meaning that you begin to receive like challenges to your faith that you begin to consider and take seriously, and that ultimately they undermined either your faith entirely or they undermined it to a degree in regards to like certain beliefs you held. Like it made you realize that the beliefs that you had long held were not exactly right or accurate. No doubt everybody's done that throughout all of human history. How did Judas go through that process? I don't know. The scriptures don't tell us a lot about Judas, right? Like Judas is, for the most part, somebody that we just do not know a lot about. We know he's one of the 12 apostles. We know that he carried a money belt, or not just a money belt. He carried the money pouch for the disciples. So he carried the money, which the scriptures tell us he did because he was stealing the money. So what that teaches me, or what that implies to me about Judas, is that he actually never probably had faith. That it seems like he actually went into this whole thing as a scam, kind of like a guy who was just trying to ride in on the laurels of this Messiah who's come to town. And so it seems like he was always a bad actor from the start. He was not like a guy who was walking with the Lord faithfully and then he turned against the Lord. Now, the second thing that we know about Judas, not second, we know a few other little things, but the other big thing we know about him is, of course, that, at least according to Matthew's account, after he betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Wait, gold or silver? Silver. After 30 pieces of silver, we know that he felt guilty. And so he went and tried to give the money back after Jesus had been taken, beaten, and sent off to be crucified. He tried to give the money back to the priests or the Sadducees who had given him the money. And they said, we don't want anything to do with that. Like, that's blood money. And so he, of course, throws it down on the ground and then runs out and kills himself. So the betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, that harkens back to the fact that he's a thief, right? He's a money lover. But the fact that he killed himself demonstrates remorse, demonstrates like a deep sense of sorrow over what he did. And so I think that's what makes people kind of look at Judas a little sympathetically, because they look at him and think, oh, he was able to at least look at Jesus and feel bad about what he had done. So there must be something like honest and true. And maybe there was. I just don't know. I mean, it's possible that he lived his whole time following Jesus and just had no real authentic investment. But then when the time came when he killed himself, I mean, even the worst of people, right? Even the worst of people, if they're like faced with a situation like that and they realize that the person they betrayed is going to be killed, like, this is a guy he lived with for 3 years. He might have just been like, wow, I'm a really terrible person. And so I just couldn't even begin to say what his real motivation was. Now, I do want to say a second thing. I think another way to kind of look at this question, and so forgive me if I'm misreading this, but a second possible reading is that maybe what you're saying is it's a critique of the idea of deconstruction, right? And saying, isn't that more or less what Judas did or something like that? And to that I would say, maybe, and I would just defer you back to what we said about deconstruction in the previous episode, where we pointed out that I think that everything hinges on what we mean by the word deconstruction. And I think sometimes when somebody is deconstructing, at least they use that word, I think they might be doing things that are fine, like, and healthy even, where they're just trying to understand their faith more, and they're maybe critiquing it in a way that's it's good and that maybe strengthens them.
Yeah.
But then there are other ways where they're just buying into a cultural rejection of our faith, and they're just indiscriminately and basically uncritically taking what our culture says and not actually stopping and being fair. Like, they basically are critiquing their own faith, but they're not critiquing the culture that's calling them to do that. So in that case, I don't know to what degree Judas was influenced by his culture and the way that they thought. So it'd be hard for me to.
I think there's another interesting thing to observe in the question that is something that we can see happening a lot in our culture, which is to take these cultural in vogue ways to think about faith and religion and Christianity, like deconstruction, and then try to find them in scripture where they really aren't there.
Yeah.
And I think you leading off by saying this is not even a concept that we would have had a category for writing about in the first century, Palestine. But we see this a lot. It's like deconstruction. Let's look for it in the Bible. Judas.
Yeah.
Trans. Let's look for it in the Bible. Eunuchs. Homosexuality, David and Jonathan.
Yeah.
It's like you find these interesting, for your mind's topics, and you look for moments. And I would say this is a potential thing that's happening here, which is like, well, I like this idea of deconstruction. I want to think about it in the Bible. So you look for someone who was once walking with Jesus who isn't, and you're like, deconstruction.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I don't know if you can parallel what's happening in 21st century Portland, Oregon with what's happening in first century Palestine. You know?
Yeah. And just to be clear for those who maybe didn't have too much context for that, like the things Tucker just referenced, like David and Jonathan, these are things that people are saying. He's not saying that's right or good.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, because David and Jonathan were not.
Definitely
gay.
not.
They were straight. But people, like, there are scholars and all sorts of, it's like a very vogue thing to try to make
transpose.
to transpose that. They're looking at our culture and the issues of our culture, and they're saying, let's try to find a Bible story that in our mind fits it, and look, we can back up what we believe,
correct,
based on these stories from the Bible.
Yeah. So I think that is another way to read this question. So whoever asked it, graciousness, thank you for your grace and how we're trying to wrestle with it. I would say maybe a better way to word it would be, did Judas deconstruct his faith? And then we could say maybe not.
Maybe not.
Depends on, and then you could say, and then when do you think that happened? And then you could say, it's not clear in the text.
It's
and
just
move
not
on.
clear. Yeah. It is possible he really loved the Lord, really followed, and then became disheartened. Basically, something disappointed him.
Yeah.
In a lot of the movies about Jesus and Judas, they portray Judas that way. That's like, I think they do that because he killed himself. I think they're trying to make sense out of the story. But I do think that it's an insufficient understanding of human nature. People can be really, really corrupt and still feel bad about things. You know what I mean? Like, so it's I think that's all I can say.
Yeah. Well, I think you did a great job.
Thanks.
Finally, you said Jesus was fully human. Did he have a sin nature but did not sin, or was he fully human except he did not have a sin nature, or something else? So,
that's a really good question. It's a really good question. And let me just say this. I can tell you, so the scripture, the only verse that really speaks to that specifically is what we read last night from Hebrews chapter 4, where it says that there is, it wasn't from Hebrews chapter 4. It was the one where it says that Jesus, actually it might be 4, I forget the exact reference, but that he's like us in all, he was tempted
in every way,
yet without sin, right? So he's like us in every way, basically, but he didn't sin. So it doesn't really go into detail beyond that. However, the church tradition has been very clear on this. The church tradition is that he did not have a sin nature, that he had a nature that was uncorrupted by a sin nature. And they often will point to it, and as far back as I've read in church fathers, they assert this, to the virgin birth of Christ, where they basically say, look, part of the reason that Jesus is born of the Virgin Mary, so he doesn't have a biological father, is that it's supposed to represent this breaking of the line of Adam, in a sense, where the sin nature that passes through us to our offspring and stuff is it ends and comes through Jesus, and Jesus is born without it. And so it's like, he's not a son of Adam. He is a son of Eve in that sense, right? He's a son of Mary, but he's not a son of Adam. And instead, God is his father, and God's perfect nature passes through. Now, that is what the church has always taught. And it's been a very like integral doctrine. I believe that. That's what I believe. But I primarily believe that because that's what the church has always taught. I don't have more of an argument for it than that, right? I mean, he is fully human, just like we are in every way. He just has never sinned. I think the only other thing I might say to that is that if you have a sin nature, then that would, actually, let me put it this way. It is sometimes hard to define exactly what a sin nature is. Like, what does it actually mean for me to have a sin nature? Like, is it a biological thing? Is it a spiritual thing? Like, I always feel like it's a biological thing because we talk about it being passed from father to son and father to son. The only way I've ever been able to define it is this, that I have a nature as a human being that can't help but sin, right? Like, I can't help it. Like, I'm not saying that in every situation where I sin that I'm incapable of being righteous. I can make good choices. I can make choices not to sin. But I cannot live in such a way that I never sin. Like, I can't. That's actually an impossibility for me and for any human being. If you're born a human, you will sin. And why will you sin? Because you have a sin nature. That's what it means to be a human being. Jesus comes, and if he never sinned, which he never sinned, then I think that itself means he didn't have a sin nature. I think that's actually just what it means. I can't say much beyond that because it's hard to even define the terms. But yes, I believe Jesus did not have a sin nature, and he never sinned. So let me add one more thing. Also, when we say, the scriptures tell us that God cannot sin, nor can be tempted to sin, right? So Jesus is fully man, but he's also fully God. And so if Jesus could be tempted to sin, then that would seem to make it that he's not God. And so that's like one more thing that kind of factors into this. Like, he has to have that nature that is incapable of sinning. So I would add that as well. Would you? Sorry, you were about to say something.
I would say not much to add other than the most important takeaway from the question is that he, in fact, whether he has a sin nature or not, and I'm with you, it's like, what does the essence of that question even mean?
Yeah.
The Orthodox answer in view of Christ is that he, in fact, did not ever sin.
Yes, never. He's never sinned.
The core of what's being tempted in the desert and him overcoming the temptations that we were tempted in so that he can sympathize with us is going to be somewhat mysterious.
Yeah.
How someone could be fully man and not sin will be mysterious. But what is not mysterious is that he never sinned.
Yes.
That he is the perfect man that knew no sin, became sin so that we could become righteousness.
Yeah. And that's the thing, like, being fully man and fully God itself is a mystery. That's something we can't explain.
So I would say this is one of those glorious questions that goes into the armchair of Christians. Really, it's like, enjoy, wrestle with it. Even if you raise your voice when you sit around a circle talking, I think that's all fine. But it is not a break fellowship question. It is not a question that should torment you as you go to bed. It's how the glorious mystery of Christ. This is that category. But as long as you land on he who knew no sin became sin, then you take communion, because that is the prerequisite for taking communion, is that the sinless one became sin so that in consuming his body and blood through communion, we can become the righteousness of Christ. Amen.
And that's it, guys.
That's it. YouTube audience, send in your questions. Thank you guys for coming in person. Thank you for watching online. We will be at it without stop now until where we will take no more weeks off. Am I right?
Well, next week. I'm still doing Wednesday next week. However, next Thursday I have report cards. or not report cards. I have parent-teacher conferences in the evening, which is when we record. So we may not get a recording in next week.
Yeah.
So, but do send in questions next week because we'll answer them the following week.
And Matt, can we get a link to maybe get a GoFundMe started for him to get a grading assistant? This is maybe an assistant to go on these trips. Just go.
Report cards. I literally
the man needs help.
Or not report cards.
The man
it's
needs help.
Parent-teacher conference.
The man. Fade to black, Matt. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Love you guys. Thanks, Tom.
All right.
See
Good
you
job.
later.
Yep. See ya.